The sun hung low over the vast expanse of the dry, cracked land. Dust swirled lazily in the breeze, a sign of the relentless heat that scorched the earth during the day. The rancher stood at the edge of his property, a solitary figure in a wide, unforgiving world. His name was Thomas Hale, but in these parts, he was simply known as the Old Man. His ranch had once been thriving, cattle roamed freely, the land rich with the promise of prosperity. But that was before everything changed. The weather had turned against him. Seasons of drought had drained the life from the soil, and his livestock had dwindled. The world was shifting, and Thomas found himself clinging to what little remained. He had no family left. His wife and son had died years ago, claimed by sickness that no doctor could cure. His only companions now were the few animals he had left quiet, loyal creatures that had become more than just beasts of burden to him. They were his last connection to a life that felt distant, almost like a dream. Though he was a man of few words, Thomas had a reputation. His actions spoke louder than any proclamation he could make. People in town knew him as a man who valued honor above all else. Yet, as the days dragged on, it became harder to hold on to that honor, knowing he had nothing left to give. The old man would rise before dawn every morning, his bones aching with age, to tend to his dying ranch. But today was different. Today, something was coming. Something he hadn't expected. It would force him to make a choice that would alter his fate forever. And just as the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, the sound of hooves reached his ears. The soft clop of hooves echoed through the stillness of the early morning, drawing Thomas Hale's attention. He squinted against the growing light, his weathered face marked by lines that spoke of years of hardship. There, emerging from the distant dust, were two figures riding with silent grace across the land, two young women on horseback. Apache. Their presence seemed almost surreal, like a mirage conjured by the heat. Thomas had heard rumors of Apache bands moving closer to his land, but this was the first time he had seen any so close to his ranch. The two sisters were dressed in simple yet sturdy clothing, their eyes sharp and watchful, their faces strikingly beautiful and strong traits honed by a life lived in the harshest of conditions. The older sister, a tall woman with jet-black hair, led the way. She was steady and composed, riding with the kind of quiet confidence that came only from experience. The younger sister, slightly smaller but with a fiercer, more restless energy, followed closely behind. Their horses were lean but strong, clearly accustomed to long journeys across rough terrain. Thomas didn't move as they approached. He didn't have to. There was something about the way they moved that suggested they had come with purpose, not seeking trouble, but prepared for it should it come. The sisters slowed as they reached him, their horses' hooves quieting against the dry earth. The older sister spoke first, her voice low but firm. "We come in peace," she said, her eyes meeting his without hesitation. It wasn't a request, it was a statement of fact. Thomas nodded, cautious, but intrigued. "What do you need?" His voice was rough, unused to conversation, but his gaze softened slightly. The younger sister shifted nervously on her saddle before speaking up. "Our horse, it died. We need another. We've traveled far, and the sun will soon be high. We cannot carry on without a horse." Thomas glanced at their worn faces and the tired horses beneath them. There was no denying the urgency in their eyes. The sight of their plight stirred something within him, something he hadn't felt in years: compassion. His own situation wasn't much better, but he had a final horse, one he had kept for himself. It was his pride, his last piece of hope, the one thing left of the life he once had. He hesitated. The silence between them stretched as the wind blew across the open land. Then, finally, Thomas spoke, his voice rough but unwavering. "You can take him, but it won't be easy." The older sister's eyes narrowed slightly, not in distrust, but as if testing his sincerity. After a long pause, she nodded. "We will honor your gift," she said, her tone laden with respect. And with that, the exchange was made, sealing an unexpected bond between them. As the sisters rode off into the rising sun, Thomas stood still, watching them disappear into the horizon. A strange feeling settled in his chest, a weight he couldn't name. He knew he had made a choice, but now that it was done, doubt crept in. His final horse, his pride, his last tie to the past was now gone. He had given it away without a second thought, but now, in the quiet aftermath, The full weight of his decision pressed on him. What did it mean to give up the one thing he had left? To sacrifice it for two strangers, two women of a tribe he barely understood? What if they never returned? What if his gesture meant nothing in the grand scheme of things? But then another thought came to him, one that unsettled him even more. Maybe that was the point. Maybe it wasn't about what he had left, but about what he could offer, even in the face of his own dwindling resources. He had spent too many years alone, hoarding what little he had, convinced that survival was all that mattered. But now, after years of solitude and quiet struggle, a part of him longed for something more, a chance to do something that mattered, something that wasn't driven by the desperation of simply holding on. He looked at the land before him, at the dry earth and the fading remnants of his once thriving ranch. Was it worth holding on to if it meant shutting himself off from the world? Could he let go of his last piece of pride and embrace something beyond survival? In that moment, Thomas made his decision. He would trust that the universe had its own way of balancing things. And, whatever came next, he would face it with honor no matter the cost. The morning air was crisp, the sky painted in hues of pink and orange, when the sound of hooves once again shattered the stillness. But this time, it was different. The rhythm was heavier, more deliberate, and carried the weight of purpose. Thomas Hale stood on the porch of his small, weathered cabin, his eyes scanning the horizon as a figure emerged from the rising dust. It wasn't the sisters. This rider was alone, and he rode with a presence that demanded attention. As the rider came closer, Thomas felt the hair on the back of his neck rise. The man was tall, his face weathered but strong, his eyes dark and piercing. His clothes were simple, yet there was an unmistakable air of authority in the way he carried himself. His horse was large, powerful, its coat gleaming in the morning light, the muscles of the animal rippling beneath the skin. The rider slowed as he reached the ranch, his steed's hooves barely making a sound on the dry earth. The man's gaze fixed on Thomas without a hint of hesitation. There was no greeting, no small talk, only an unspoken understanding between them. This was not just a visit, this was something far deeper. The man dismounted with the fluidity of someone who had spent his life in the saddle. He stood tall before Thomas, and for a long moment neither spoke. The silence stretched, heavy with meaning, until finally the man's deep voice broke it. "I am Kachina," he said, his accent thick, his words deliberate. "I am the father of the two sisters you helped. They have spoken of you." Thomas nodded, unsure what to say. He had expected something like this word would travel fast in these parts, especially when it involved the Apache. But he hadn't anticipated the father's arrival so soon, nor the quiet strength that seemed to emanate from him. "I did what any man would have done," Thomas replied gruffly. "They needed help." Kachina's eyes narrowed, studying him for a moment. "It is not help that you gave," he said. "It is something deeper. My daughters came to you in need, and you gave them your last horse. That is not a simple favor. It is a gesture of honor." Thomas felt a strange knot form in his stomach. The weight of the man's words settled on him like a boulder. He had acted out of instinct, not expectation. But now, facing Kachina, he understood the gravity of what he had done. And he knew the Apache father would not leave without honoring that gesture in some way. The sun had risen high when Kachina left. He didn't say much, only that he would return, and that Thomas should expect him. But even then, the old rancher couldn't have imagined what that return would look like. The day passed slowly, the dust still swirling in the oppressive heat, and for a time, Thomas nearly forgot. Nearly. By the time the evening air cooled, Thomas was on his porch once again, staring out at the barren land, the weight of his decision still lingering. He hadn't fully understood what had transpired that morning, but something deep inside him told him that his life was about to change, perhaps in ways he couldn't control. He had no way of knowing that Kachina's word would be more than just a promise. It would be an offering that would alter the course of everything. Then, as the sun began its slow descent behind the mountains, a distant sound reached Thomas's ears. It started low, like a whisper in the wind, and grew steadily louder, the unmistakable beat of hooves, many hooves. Thomas stood up, squinting toward the horizon. For a long moment, all he could see was the dust rising, a thick wall of earth and heat. And then, as the dust cleared, he saw them, a procession of horses, stretching as far as the eye could see. The horses were sleek, strong, and numerous at least 200, maybe more. They moved in perfect unity, each rider steady in the saddle, their faces as hard and unreadable as stone. It was a sight to behold. At the head of the procession, riding with unmatched grace and authority, was Kachina. He had returned, not alone, but with a tribute, one that no man, not even Thomas Hale, could have predicted. The Apache father guided his steed toward Thomas, his eyes calm but resolute. The horses behind him seemed to flow in a river of power and beauty, an offering that was both rare and sacred. When Kachina stopped before Thomas, he dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate. "This," Kachina said, his voice low, "is the gift of my people. 300 of the finest horses from our herd. It is more than just an offering. It is our way of showing respect. You gave my daughters more than a horse, you gave them a future. We, in turn, offer you this." Thomas stood there, stunned. He couldn't fathom it, the enormity of it. 300 horses. It was a fortune. A legacy. He had given away his last horse out of kindness, never imagining such a return, a repayment so beyond anything he could have dreamed. But as the Apache father looked at him with steady, unwavering eyes, Thomas realized that this was no ordinary transaction. This was something far greater. This was honor, and it had come full circle. Thomas Hale stood at the edge of his porch, the evening wind gently tugging at his weathered coat. His gaze remained fixed on the herd of horses, a breathtaking sea of motion, each one a creature of untamed beauty and raw strength. 300 horses, more than he could ever hope to manage, more than he could ever need. They stood there in the twilight, each one a living testament to the generosity of the Apache people, a gift that seemed as vast and incomprehensible as the land itself. His mind raced, trying to understand the enormity of the gesture. What had he done to deserve this? He had given away his last horse without a thought, not expecting anything in return, and certainly not this an offering of 300. The question gnawed at him, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to truly reflect. His life had been defined by solitude, survival, and self-reliance. He had spent so long hoarding what little he had left, convinced that holding on tightly to his last possessions would somehow keep the world at bay. But now, standing before the gift that had been given to him, he saw things differently. He understood the weight of what had transpired. The Apache had not just given him horses. They had given him something far more valuable: trust, respect, and the promise of a bond that transcended the boundaries of race, culture, and history. Thomas felt a deep, quiet hum in his chest as the full realization settled in. This wasn't just about horses. It was about the kind of man he wanted to be, a man who could see beyond the narrow confines of his own survival, a man who understood that true strength lay not in what one could hoard, but in what one could give. Turning to Kachina, who stood nearby, his expression inscrutable but full of quiet pride, Thomas felt something stir inside him. He had been given a chance, an opportunity to build something lasting, something greater than himself. His ranch, his life, could be more than a solitary existence defined by loss. It could be a place of respect, a bridge between worlds that had been separated for so long. "I don't know what to say," Thomas admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "You don't need to," Kachina replied, his gaze steady. "Your actions have already spoken louder than words." And with that, Thomas knew the path ahead. He would rebuild, not just his ranch, but the very foundation of his life. The horses would help, but it was the unspoken bond between him and the Apache people, the respect, the trust that would shape the future. No longer a man living in isolation, Thomas had become part of something larger, something that would endure. The last traces of sunlight faded behind the distant hills, leaving the ranch bathed in the soft, golden light of dusk. The land, once barren and dry, seemed to breathe with a renewed energy, the horses grazing in the fields like silent sentinels to the promise of a new beginning. Thomas Hale stood on his porch, his hands resting against the rough wood, his eyes drawn to the herd that had transformed the landscape before him. The wind had shifted, cooler now, carrying with it the scent of fresh earth and the faintest hint of something wild. In that moment, Thomas felt the weight of years of struggle lifting from his shoulders. He no longer felt like a man clinging desperately to the past, trying to hold on to something that was slipping away. He had been given a chance to start anew, not just with the horses, but with everything that had once seemed lost. He could hear the soft rhythmic sound of hooves from the nearby corral, the horses settling into their new home. Each one was a reminder of the Apache father's trust, of the bond that had been forged between them, a bond that went beyond words. Thomas had always believed in the value of hard work and self-reliance, but now, as the herd grew larger and the days passed, he understood something deeper. It was the connections we made, the acts of kindness and honor, that gave life its true meaning. Kachina had come and gone, but his presence remained with Thomas like a quiet echo. There were no more words to be said between them, only the understanding that had passed between their eyes, the silent agreement that the future would be different. The horses were a gift, but the bond they symbolized was far more valuable. Thomas had given a horse out of kindness, expecting nothing in return. But the return had been beyond anything he could have imagined. It was a lesson in humility, in the power of giving without expectation. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared, the first stars began to appear in the sky, scattered across the vast expanse above. The night was coming, but Thomas didn't feel the familiar weight of solitude pressing in. Instead, he felt a quiet peace, the kind of peace that comes when you realize that, no matter how hard life has been, the universe has a way of balancing things out in the end. Turning away from the porch, he entered the small cabin he had called home for so many years. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow across the room. He took a seat at the worn table, his hands resting on the rough wood. The weight of the day settled into his bones, but this time it was a different kind of weight. Not one of loss or fear, but of responsibility. The ranch was no longer just his to tend. It belonged to something greater now, a legacy of honor, a promise made, and a future that was yet to unfold. As the flames danced in the hearth, Thomas Hale closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the quiet hum of the land beneath him, the soft breath of the horses outside, and the understanding that his life, like the land itself, was being reborn. Tomorrow would come, and with it, new challenges. But for the first time in years, he was no longer afraid of them. Whatever the future held, he would meet it with honor, with the strength of the Apache people in his heart, and with the belief that kindness could indeed change the course of a man's life. And as the moon rose high in the sky, casting a silver glow over the fields, Thomas Hale knew that this was just the beginning.